What we'd like to do right now is to show you the procedures necessary to produce a mold so that you can inject a silicone partial foot prosthesis. For the purpose of this demonstration, when we actually get to injecting the silicone, we use a clear unpigmented silicone so you can see the various components that are in the final device. The first step we need to do is just cast the patient. You can do that with any particular technique you feel comfortable with. Once that cast is done, we need to find some way to embed an ankle bolt and a T-nut into that plaster cast. This will later on be used as a way to secure this partial foot cast up inside the mold we're going to create. So I've split this open just so I can show you where we want to have this T-nut embedded. It'll sit right in the middle of the cast here and allow us again to bolt this up into the female parts of the mold. I've cut a little bit off the top of this model just to flatten the surface out, and I'm going to put a couple of rubber bands here just to hold it together temporarily. We're going to be doing a lot of modifying in this model, so all we need to do is really just hold it together enough so we can fill it up with some plaster. Okay, we're going to seal off this mold now so we can prepare it for filling with plaster. We're just going to put enough plaster on there so it doesn't leak. Okay, once that's sealed, then we're going to go ahead, put a little baby powder in there just to make it easy to remove later on. Just dust a little in there. You can use soapy water if you want, or baby powder, doesn't make much difference. Then we're going to have to find a way to hold this bolt where we want it in the cast. So to do that, I just cut a little piece of plastic here with a hole in it, put the bolt in there, and we'll set the T-nut down so that it's about a half an inch from the end of the bolt here. I'll take a little Vaseline and just wipe it on the end of that bolt, trying to fill up the threads a little bit so that when we fill this with plaster, that those threads don't get stuck in there. We want it to thread into the T-nut and not necessarily the plaster, so we'll fill those up a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and set it right in the middle of this model here. So it's right in the middle of the model. Now we'll go ahead and fill it with plaster. We got the plasters now hardened up sufficiently to start to take this mold apart. I'll just get the bolt out of here to start off with. Set that aside for just a second. Then I'll just strip the plaster off of this model, and we'll begin to prepare it for the mold making process. Okay, we'll just strip the shell off here. Okay, there's the mold we poured up. A few little bubbles in there. We're going to modify this a lot, so we'll have plenty of time to fill up all those little holes. Like all these silicone projects, you want to get your model as smooth as very possible. Any little tiny bubbles that are left in there will be filled with the silicone and create little dimples inside the eventual product. I'm then going to go ahead and try to decide what kind of trim lines I want on this particular device. And this will be a very individual thing depending on where you think they belong. With this particular one, I'm going to go just about the middle of both the medial and lateral malleoli, a little higher in the back and then back down in the front. This is just going to be a guideline for where I want to start and stop my sculpting. We'll then begin to modify this model a little bit. Typically, when you're making any sort of an elastic product, you're going to modify this model an awful lot. Remember, you have a flexible product, so if we made it off of this cast, it's pretty much guaranteed to be loose when you put it back on the person's foot. So we're going to do take a lot of material off this area and this area back here to try to get this elastic product to actually cup onto the foot and clip right on there. In order to make things a little bit easier to modify, I welded a foot bolt on the end of one of these pipes, and that can be threaded into the T-nut, which will hold this thing nice and secure while you're doing your modifications in the vise. Now I'm going to go ahead and begin modifying this model. Again, this will take some time and some experience. There's no way I can guide you through the modification process, except to say that probably the first couple times you do this, you'll not remove enough plaster from that model. These things have to fit very tightly on their foot, so don't be surprised when you see how much I actually take off this model. I'm going to go ahead and start filing away at it. Again, just as a way to tighten it up circumferentially. Quite a bit off the sides and the back. You got the Achilles tendon back there, and you don't want to take too much of that area, but it must be tightened up a little bit. And then quite a bit just forward of the Achilles tendon there. And then just a little bit around circumference. You'll see that I'm taking off the prominent areas of the malleoli. Again, we're making a product that will stretch over those areas. At this point, any other modifications you might want to make on the model that you think is appropriate. If you need to relieve certain sensitive areas on the bottom of the foot, you'll go ahead and modify those as you typically would. You can see this one's been modified quite a bit on the bottom to provide a lot of pressure in this area and keep the pressure off these two bony areas he has here. I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit more off the front until I think that I've got enough off of this model to provide the correct fit. Again, this is going to take a little bit of time for you to learn how much to remove, particularly for different sorts of people. If they're big and fleshy people, or they're very small, skinny people, that will require a little practice. And I'm going to skip some of the modification steps that you're all familiar with as far as adding plaster in different areas to relieve pressure areas and things like that. You're all very familiar with those particular techniques, and there's really no need for me to go over those right now. So I've reduced this circumferentially. You can see I've cut it down quite a bit in the back. I tried to stay away from my trim lines for the time being. I'm going to go back now and reestablish those trim lines where I think they belong. So this line I'm drawing on here now is going to represent the very top part of this silicone partial foot. Okay, so this is the trim line I've chosen for right now. The next thing we're going to do, and like you have to do with all of these mold making techniques when you're using plaster of Paris or non-flexible mold materials, is we've got to get rid of these undercuts that are here. If we poured plaster over the top of this model right now, we'd never be able to remove it. So I need to taper all this stuff towards the bolt. And as we taper this towards the bolt, we're going to do it in angles. So when those angles are bolted into the top of the model, that'll prevent this thing from rotating. It'll act as a key to hold it in place so we don't have to worry about rotations. So let me go ahead and begin to do that, and then I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Right now I'm just going to start modifying from my trim line up towards the bolt. Trying to remove any undercuts that might be there and then leave me with these nice flat areas that will key into the top of the mold. All those overhanging areas are all now tapered towards the bolt. Imagine what we're going to do. We're going to pour a solid piece of plaster over this, and we need to be able to remove this from that plaster model. So these have to be tapered away. If you don't do that step, two things are going to happen. One is the worst part of it is you're going to lock your mold into the top so it can't be removed. The second thing that's going to happen, or could happen, is you'll break the top of the mold off when you try to remove it. So check those tapers and take another look at them. Make sure everything is sloping towards the bolt and nothing's going to get caught inside the mold. From this point, we're just going to smooth things up. Just every time I wipe off this trim line, I want to continue to reestablish it so I have a reference point for my sculpting. In the process of sculpting clay over this model. This is an insole pattern I've taken out from the patient's shoe. It's real important when you're sculpting any of these feet, take an insole pattern from their shoe and do all your sculpting so it fits within the confines of that insole pattern. If you were to take an alginate model, for example, of their sound side foot and mirror image sculpt to match that foot, it probably wouldn't fit in the shoe. So I go ahead and do this routinely. We'll sculpt right on top of an insole pattern. I'm going to use a 5mm thickness, which is going to represent the bottom layer of silicone on the partial foot. In order to make sure that I get that 5mm thickness, I'll take my clay, and this is a product called clean clay. It has no sulfur in it whatsoever. Any of these materials you use here with the platinum-based silicones, you want to stay away from any kind of sulfurized products whatsoever. Matter of fact, even latex gloves have enough sulfur in them to kind of poison this material. If there's sulfur in the environment, the silicone won't set up. So make sure when you're getting this stuff, you specifically get a clay that has no sulfur in it whatsoever. We've gone ahead and cut a couple of little shims, little 5mm shims out of peelite here. So we're going to lay those out on the table. And we'll begin to roll in that with this little rolling pin over the top of those. And what's going to happen, it'll turn this clay into a 5mm sheet when we're done. We just really need this piece big enough to completely cover our insole pattern. There we go. Got 5mm, at least the size of the insole pattern. We're then going to go ahead and trim that clay out to match the pattern of the insole. Now we can set aside the 5mm insole pattern and begin rolling out some clay that we're going to use for the sides of the prosthesis itself. For that, we'll use a 3mm profile. We just want to roll out a big sheet of this clay because we have to completely cover the model with clay. So we'll just soften this up a little bit and begin the process of rolling it down between these little 3mm thick pieces of peelite I've laid on the table. Again, as long as we're using our rolling pin between these pieces of peelite, we're going to get a nice 3mm level on that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cover this model with that 3 mils of clay. I usually like to start off with the bottom piece first. Just start pressing it on the model. Not hard enough to thin this clay out, but hopefully hard enough to help start to secure it onto the model itself. And then we're going to cover this up the rest of the way here. Okay, so we just about got this thing pretty well covered with our 3mm worth of clay. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take a second here. We're going to start to smooth all this stuff up. It might take a couple of minutes to get that all done. One thing you can do, just as a little hint, if you're unsure whether you've pressed out too much of this clay and have lost your 3 millimeters, so you can go around and check this thickness wherever you want by pressing the pin or the knife blade in there. Make sure you haven't thinned it out too much in any one particular place. We'll have more opportunity to smooth this as we move along, but we just want to make sure it's stuck onto the model pretty well and that we're not thinning any areas out. We're just trying to smooth stuff up. You can use tools, you can use tongue depressors, fingers, whatever you need to try to get this thing nice and smooth and stuck tightly to the model. If you have a real loose place back here, it's a little loose back in this area, I'm just going to go ahead and cut a little wedge out of the clay and then tighten it up on there. We'll pull that little piece out and we'll kind of tailor it up to fit a little tighter on there. Remember, if there's any void places or any gaps in this clay, it's going to result in a thickened area in the final silicone product. So this has got to be on there pretty tight. We've got this model pretty well smoothed up now and we're ready to go to the next step. We're going to take this model we just made and we're going to place it on top of our insole pattern. Just lining things up where you think they belong. We got the heel just about in the back of the insole pattern. And this area represents what we're going to clean up with the toes. Sometimes you can find donated toes off of old feet, old sash feet, or old spring-like covers, old flex foot covers, that sort of thing. Find a toe style that matches the patient pretty well, and we can use these. You can fill this area with clay if you'd like, and mirror image sculpt to a model of their foot. This is just a very quick and easy way to do it. So I've got this thing prepared here. Let me move the model back just a little bit. And we'll get those toes on there. Again, hoping that they all stay within the confines of the insole pattern. Fill in all these areas with clay and then blend everything in very nicely. Okay, right now I'm just going to go along here and I'm just going to start filling in all the little gaps that might be there, all the little voids, just beginning to make this thing look like a foot. Spending some time just kind of smoothing up this clay and trying to flare it in the foot. I also turned it upside down. I did a little work down here just creating an arch so it'll fit nicely in the shoe. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm not going to take all the time I normally would to put all the fine detail in. You can get as elaborate as you want with these things. You can add little veins to them if you want to put those in there. You can add skin texture. Like I mentioned before, you can custom shape the toes. What we'd like to do is get this smoothed up so we can go through the mold making process, leaving it up to you to spend as much time as necessary to arrive at the amount of detail you'd like to see in the model. One of the things that's important about making a mold like this is you have to decide where the seam line is going to be. How is this mold going to come apart without trapping this silicone product in the inside? And something that you can do is you can take a look on how a square fits around the edge of the model here. Wherever that square touches is where that seam is going to have to be. Half the mold will remove from that section, half to remove from this section. So you won't find this won't become a straight line. It's going to go up and down depending on where the high parts of the mold are. So let me go ahead and start drawing that a little bit on here, and you'll get an idea what I'm talking about. And then here. And then I'll go back and connect all these dots to give myself an idea where that line belongs. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to roll out some flat pieces of this as a water base or pottery clay. We're going to use that, as you'll see in a minute, some walls to determine the seam line for this mold to help separate the top from the bottom. The water-based clay is used, number one, because it won't stick to the clay we've already sculpted with. So when it comes time to remove it, we won't be destroying our model that we just created there. So we'll do the same thing here. This doesn't have to be done to any thickness accuracy whatsoever. We just want to get a couple of nice flat slabs out of it. I've rolled this out, so this is now approximately 3/8 of an inch thick. We'll just make sure it's all nice and smooth. Then we're going to cut it into strips. Okay, we'll separate those and just set them aside for just a moment. We're now going to go back to our model, and one of the things that's probably the most difficult thing to do is to get this to contour into the shape of the toe. So I've saved this one fairly large piece of clay that we just laid out there. I'm just going to lay the foot on it here, and I'm going to cut away the shapes of those toes. Again, this doesn't have to be done in any super accurate fashion, but let's just get the shape there so that this will now fit up in the shape of the toes there. What we're going to do with these pieces of clay is we're going to lay these up so this clay fits right along that seam line that we just developed. In order to hold them in place, we're going to have to fill this up with some more water-based clay to support these little walls we're going to make here. Trying when to do this, when I'm doing this, I'm trying not to really press this against the model all that hard. I just want something to support those little clay walls that we're going to set on there. So we'll just mash this stuff on there, trying to follow the contour that we developed with our square, which is going to represent the seam line. Just think of this as a support structure for those walls that we're going to place on there in a second. Now we can take the clay that we've prepared into these strips, start to place this on here so that it follows that line that we developed. In just a minute I'll be pushing this down so we can just barely see the orange line there. You might want to take just a few minutes doing this because a nice clean line here means a nice separation of the mold. So we'll go ahead and try to just smooth this up and press it up against the mold pretty carefully. Again, I can use my little wooden sculpting tool to do this. You'll see here's the line here. I'm actually going to press up a little bit against the model so that there's no gap left between this clay and that model. And you want to do this. You want to be careful. You spent all this time developing this nice sculpture. You don't really want to press into it while you're doing this. I've just about got this clay all smoothed off now. And you see what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to keep it a nice flat surface here. Everything tied up against the model. We don't want any plaster to run down in there. So if you see any little gaps there, you're going to have to go back and fill those things in. And just give it a once more over before we do the next step and make sure this is nice and smooth. Again, it doesn't have to be super smooth, but you don't want to have any big lumps and bumps or chunks hanging there either. Let's just smooth it out a little bit. I'm also going to take my knife now, and anything that's sticking out here from my clay wall I'm going to remove. This will help me be able to determine how thick the plaster I'm putting on there actually is. So we'll get rid of this piece. We'll get rid of this. We'll get rid of that. We'll just trim it up all the way around to the same size as our little clay wall that we've developed. Okay, for the top half of this mold, don't worry about what anything this stuff down here looks like. This has nothing to do with it. We're just going to be casting the very top half of this mold. So from here up, you want to have everything as smooth as can be, fairly clean, if you can keep it that way, and we're going to be ready to put the top of the mold on there. If you've spent a great deal of time sculpting beautiful toes and sculpting nice skin detail and all that stuff, be sure you don't press on it with your hands and mess all that nice detail up. We're going to put some kind of parting agent up here. We're going to pour plaster over the top of this, and we sure don't want it to stick to this. So we'll put a little layer of Vaseline up there to prevent any sticking. If you have any spray parting agents or any the cellulose acetate we use as parting agents, anything like that's fine for the top here, as long as it doesn't stick itself together when you're done. I tell you what, and with this stage, when in doubt, put another layer on there, because you never want to lock these things in there having that plaster stick to itself. If you get a little Vaseline down here, don't even worry about that. That's all going to rub off in just a second as we smooth this all up the last time. You can use Vaseline on this clay to help smooth things up a little bit. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to just reestablish that edge and flare it all in real nice. And just make sure, once again, at the very last minute here, everything's smooth and fitting tightly against the model. We're going to Vaseline up this bolt again before we put it back into the plaster model. And let's thread down in there. Start threading that bolt in there, and we're going to hit the bottom and then back it off about a quarter of a turn or so. We want to leave maybe an inch or an inch and a half here of bolt. When we put the plaster on this model, it's going to come up from the sides, and it's going to come up right to the head of this bolt. And this is going to determine how thick the top of our mold is. Let's go ahead and mix some plaster to start this next process here. This can be done in 2 or 3 steps if you want. There's no reason you have to get this plaster put on all at the same time. But what I'd like to do right now is we're using some salt in the water to try to accelerate this plaster a little bit again, just so we can do it in a timely fashion for you here. Get you a good idea of what it takes to get the top of this mold in place. And we're just looking to start off with a fairly creamy consistency for this first layer of plaster. Don't want it to be too thick. This first layer of plaster on the model is going to be the most important. We want to have this pretty much bubble free. So I got a regular 1-inch brush here, and I'm going to slap this first coat onto the model, trying to make sure I get it in all these little grooves that we've developed here. So I'm being very careful to get along this edge here and make sure that's all filled in and no bubbles in there. I think I'll work around the edges first. And then we'll start getting some coverage over the whole model. Now, if you want to run very little risk of damaging your sculpture, you can let this first layer start to harden up before you add any other layers on there. I'm going to try to do it all in one piece. Some coverage, working mostly around the seam line here to start off with. The rest of it, as it thickens up, I'll scoop it up a little higher on the top. You'll notice we have some plaster running over the edges here. Let's not to worry about that right now. We'll clean that up in just a second. If you get a little too much coming over the edges, you can always start to just clean that up a little bit until you touch your clay again. And just let the excess sit on the tray here. Well, that'll get cleaned up in just a minute here. Well, our plaster's all set up here now. It's just, it's still pretty hot, so this plaster's kicking. We're going to go ahead and turn this thing upside down and remove this little bottom tray here. I'll show you the bottom. We'll just let that come off kind of slowly here. Anything that's going to come off with this bottom piece now, don't worry, we're going to remove it anyway. So here's our original clay sculpture. And these are the walls that we built around it to provide a seam line for the mold itself. We'll just go ahead and start pulling that clay off of there. I'll remove it here. And you can see that underneath it we've got a nice flat smooth surface with no bubbles or dimples. This is a time when you can go back if you want and clean up the bottom of the model a little bit. If you want to just put some more shape in these toes on the bottom, you can do that. It's a chance to go back one more time before we pour the bottom and maybe finish up any sculpting or smoothing things off if you want. So I'll just smooth this off a little bit on the bottom. One of the things that a lot of the comments we got when we first did these partial feet, a lot of people complained, practitioners, not necessarily patients, but a lot of people complained that the toe area was very heavy. So what we want to do is before we make the bottom of this mold, we're going to dig a little hollow area in here that's going to later on be filled with a silicone foam to lighten up these toes. So I'm just going to very quickly draw that on there just to get an idea of the area I want to dig away. And I'm going to dig some of that clay out of there. So I'm going to go ahead and dig a section out of this toe area so that can later be filled with silicone foam and really lighten up this whole device quite a bit. There we go. I'm going to go back and take a little bit of clay now and just push it back in here. This is not our model. That's part of our clay buildup, but we're just going to smooth this hole out. So that it can be filled with plaster. So this little hollow section here that we've developed will be later filled with silicone foam to keep this device very light across the toes. This particular mold doesn't have a lot of shapes and angle to it. So again, we're going to have to put some kind of a marks or some registration points in here so the bottom and the top part of this mold don't slide back and forth on each other. We're going to do that again with just a big drill. We're just going to make a couple little dimples in there. They don't have to be real deep, they don't have to be real severe, but we want to make enough of a dimple in there so that these two pieces will kind of key together into those holes. Usually I'll put two on each side. One. All right, we've used the drill to put these little registration points in there. Again, when the bottom of this mold and the top of this mold together, those registration points will hold these two together so they can't slide in any direction. The next thing we need to do now is just clean up any little plaster specks that are left on there. And again, very important, we're going to have to get some parting agent on here so that these two pieces of mold, these two halves of molds don't stick together. So again, we'll use some Vaseline or any kind of parting agent you think. You can use some spray parting agents. And just make sure you get everything covered with Vaseline so nothing sticks together. Nothing's more frustrating to do all this work on one of these molds, pour the bottom on there and have it all glue itself together so you can't take it apart without breaking it into many pieces. And the bottom of this is a really easy thing to pour. We're going to take some of our wax again. We're just going to wax up a couple pieces of cardboard real quick here. what we do, and we'll be stapling those all around to act as a dam and just pour this thing full of plaster on the top. I think it's going to take a couple of pieces to go all the way around there, so I'll prepare them beforehand. Okay, we've got those two pieces waxed up. Let's go ahead and start stapling them up on the edge here. When I was making this mold, I tried to give myself a little edge around here, a pretty straight edge for stapling this cardboard onto. So let me set this down here, and I'll start stapling this cardboard on there. For just a minute here. Okay, so we'll just finish up this dam and we'll be ready to pour the bottom part of the mold. Okay, we've created ourselves a nice little dam to contain that plaster when we pour it in there. Look at this little dam I put on here. I can see some light through that. When I pour that full of plaster, it's going to leak right out of the sides there. So I'm just going to take some of this water-based clay and just stuff it underneath to fill up those little voids, those little holes, so we have as little leakage as possible. I'm going to go ahead and mix up some plaster, not too thick, but just pour it right inside here. So it's about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick. I'm just going to pour it in there. Our plaster is now set up for the bottom of this mold. Now these two pieces will be stuck together a little bit, even though we put enough Vaseline on there. And what we're going to have to do here is get a screwdriver in there and just gently tap on this mold till we start to separate the two pieces. So let me go ahead and do that. And this is one of the times when you don't want to get too aggressive with these things. You take it kind of easy. And what happens actually as you start to tap these things loose, you can hear a change in the sound as it starts to hollow up and come loose there. So I'm just going to, there it is right there. I don't know if you could hear that, but it starts to sound real hollow all of a sudden. And that's these two pieces starting to separate. There we go. Coming apart nicely. If you've got enough parting agent on there, these things aren't going to get stuck together. So here we're going to go ahead and pull this apart now. And you'll see chunks of clay and things are going to come off of there. All kinds of stuff's going to come off of there, because this is the clay that we use for sculpting. Still real hot here from the molding process. It's going to be a little hard to clean up for you right now. We'll clean this up in a minute, but I'll get the majority of it off of there so you can see the bottom half of the mold. There we go. That's coming pretty clean here. You can see the little hollow area that we figured out is now looks like a little bump in the mold here. So when we actually form the silicone in there, whatever shape we had made out of the clay is going to turn into silicone when we're all done here. So we've got the bottom half of the mold here. You can see the modified model is in there. The little toe extension we put is on there. That's going to come out. We've got our toe detail here. In order to get this part out, what I'll typically do is I'll back this bolt out a little ways until it's just about ready to fall out of there. And then just press it down on the table. See if we can get that to come out here. So I'm going to just put a little pressure here. That worked great that time. So here's our modified model coming out of there. There's our modified model. Here's our bolt that was holding it in place. We'll start to clean the clay out of here. This side of the mold's cold, so this clay is going to come out a little bit cleaner than that last piece I did. The cold clay will remove a lot easier than the hot stuff. If you remember the angles that we put on this when we were preparing the model here, those angles are going to now key into the top of the mold. So when this thing's in place, it's going to go back in the same orientation every single time. If we hadn't put those there and it shifted sideways just a little bit, we'd end up with a very thin wall in our silicone. Once the mold's been clearly taken apart, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and clean up all the clay out of the mold so there's no remnants of the clay left whatsoever. If there's any bubbles or anything in there, now's the time you can go back and sort of fill those in or fix that mold up if you need to. We also need to think about how we're going to inject the silicone here and how the silicone is going to flow as it's being injected. What we've done is we've drilled a hole through the back of this, back in the heel area. So let me put the foot insert in there for a second. And we're going to watch silicone is going to come in from the bottom. We're going to actually inject this in an upside down position. So I'll take a look at the bottom here for just a second. You see we've got some holes drilled up around the toes there. There's one for each toe. There's also another hole just in the back of this area where we're afraid it might trap a bubble of air there when we put the silicone in. We're going to put the top and the bottom together with the insert and the stockings and all the reinforcement in there. We'll go through that in just a second. The injection hole's in the back here. We're going to put the gun in from there. We're going to let this thing start to fill up until we see silicone vent out of all the holes at the toes. One of the things we like to do is, especially for the kids, we like to try to get some kind of fabric, if we can, actually into the silicone itself. What that's going to do, that's going to increase the tear strength a little bit. We do that with a couple of nylon knee-high stockings, or any kind of fabric you like to put in there. And to hold those in place, we're going to place them over the model, and we're going to put just a tiny bit of this spray glue on top of there to actually stick it into place. So let me do that right now. You want to be careful not to put too much spray glue up around this area, or you might actually glue it into the mold itself and have a heck of a time getting them apart. So just a little tiny bit of glue here, very light coat just to stick it in place a little bit. We'll go ahead and put the stocking on there. And stick it down up on the edges. Again, we've just got enough glue to hold that in place so it doesn't slip off the model. 1 or 2 stockings is fine. For this example, we'll just use the 1 stocking. So we just got a little tiny bit of spray glue on the top of this. We'll just trim the top of that stocking off so we can bolt it back into the mold. The molds don't really require any special preparation. You can put any kind of parting agent in there if you'd like. We'll put this insert back in place and then bolt it up to hold its rotation. Okay, there we're all set up in there now. We've got the nylon stock and the insert in the top of the mold. We'll go ahead and place the bottom there. There are commercially available some mold straps you can use to hold this together for right now, and what we use quite often is just some regular old yellow pressure sensitive tape. We'll just tape that together and we're ready to start injecting this with silicone. These cartridges are all pre-packed. We'll break the top off just to provide the opening. We have these mix and dispense nozzles, and that's going to go ahead and meter this stuff, mix it and dispense it at the same time. This tube is going to go into a pneumatic injection gun. The very first little bit of silicone that comes out there won't be mixed, so I'm going to go ahead and just let a little bit into the top of this before I start the injection. This 20 durometer silicone we use for the partial foot has about a 5-hour cure time. So typically we do these in the afternoon and let them sit overnight. We'll just get it off the machine here. We're going to remove the silicone that vented out of the holes, and we'll get the tape off of here so we can open this mold up. Going to be stuck together a little bit, but you can pull it apart fairly easily. This is what we've got just coming out of the mold here now. Again, we've got some flashing we'll have to cut off and trim later. We've got the bolt back in there. We're going to push this out just like the way we did the clay model. Sometimes you got to put it down on the floor and push pretty hard to get these things out of here. So I'm going to push, push, and push until this finally starts to break loose. You can peel the toes up a little bit, start to loosen things up that way. And just keep pushing and peeling until it finally comes loose there. There we go. You can see it starting to come out. There we go. There's the foot as it comes out of the mold. This will need to be washed and cleaned. Show you how the nylon stocking is incorporated into the silicone for reinforcement purposes. If necessary with the silicone materials, you can sand on them if you need to. Just use a brand new sanding cone on any one of the routers, or a brand new cone on a little Dremel tool, and you can sand the silicone pretty well. We need to fill this void that we created with some soft foam. What we'll do is we'll pour the foam in there, we'll seal this off with a piece of plastic with a little vent hole on the top, let that excess foam escape out of the vent. Once the foam is cured, we can remove this little excess foam that came out. We can go ahead and take that piece of foam to the back, sand the top off so it's nice and smooth, and then we'll be able to replace it and seal it off with the fabric. Now we're going to put a reinforcing layer over the entire bottom of this foot. That's really done for two reasons. One is to secure this foam in place. The other thing is we put that on there as a non-abrasive surface. So if somebody's going to walk around the swimming pool or going to walk around outside on the cement, they won't wear out the silicone too quickly. We do that with a regular cotton sock. We're just going to place that over the whole foot here. And then we're going to saturate this sock with this silicone adhesive. We've now got this all covered up with it's a thin cotton stocking, and I'm going to use this silicone adhesive to bond these pieces all together. We're just going to place some of the silicone adhesive around the area on top of the stocking, and then we'll work that in with a tongue depressor so we completely saturate the cotton sock and have it stick to the silicone underneath. Okay, you can see that we've got the sock now pretty well saturated, and I've worked this in through the sock and to the silicone below. One of the things we do to get the real nice smooth surface on the bottom here is with this silicone adhesive, we'll spray it with a little alcohol. This technique of reinforcing the bottom of the partial foot and the use of the silicone adhesives can also be done for repairing any kind of silicones that you might have. So any of your silicone liners or silicone products whatsoever, if they develop a little tear or a wear spot, it's very easy to go back and glue them back together or repair that damaged area with the silicone adhesive. It has a great number of uses. It's a single component, so it's just going to dry exposed to the air, and it'll dry in about 25 or 30 minutes. Once the fabric is completely trimmed away, we can remove it from the mold. You can see that these are very durable products. This reinforcement we put on here will prevent any wear of the silicone from any rough surface that might be walked on. You can see from the function of this, the toes bend very nicely, but still remains very stable on the cast. We'll go ahead and take the foot off the mold here, and we'll take a look at the final product. You can see the reinforcement on the inside. You can see the flexibility of the toes. You can see the compression from the foam that we've locked in here. Now you've seen how easy it is to actually make a partial foot prosthesis. This is an excellent prosthesis of choice for many people that are not really super highly active. They work very well, they last a long time, it has all the advantages of the silicone products. We have our durability, we have our flexibility, very hygienic, can be worn in the water, in around swimming pools or the ocean. It's very easy to remove and clean, and they basically last a very long time. You can see that this particular partial foot prosthesis has the optional sport adapter. This is used to stiffen up the toe lever for high activities such as running, mountain climbing, and bicycle riding.